Good evening. As you know, I'm Nancy Berman, and I'm the program chair of the Harvard Club of Chicago. And we're really delighted to have you all here tonight. And we think it's going to be an exciting program, and it's kind of a rather an exquisite site that we're lucky enough to be here in. Several years ago, I had the privilege of meeting Barbara Mahaney. We both worked on a project together at the Chicago Tribune. While she was there, she decided to marry a man named Blair Kamin. I said, well, pretty good idea. Well, it turned out it really was. And as you know, Blair has had many, many accolades and awards and is the architectural editor of the Chicago Tribune. Blair is not a graduate of Harvard. However, he did attend two quite nice schools, Amherst and the Yale University College of Architecture. However, either Blair or Harvard saw the light, and Blair became a Nieman Fellow in 2012 and 2013. That's really, as you know, a Nieman Fellowship enables a mid-career journalist to fabricate any program he might wish while at Harvard. Blair tonight is going to discuss why he elected to study the Harvard Gates, and perhaps he'll give us a few comments about Chicago architecture. I'd like to introduce Blair Kamin, my friend and a new Harvardian. Blair.
Thank you, Nancy. You're very open-minded to invite a Yalie to be within your midst. I really appreciate that. There are really two people I want to thank tonight, and Nancy, of course, is one of them. To say that she is organized is kind of like saying that the Chicago City Council has a lot of corrupt aldermen on it. I got the first email from Nancy exactly 1 year and 1 day ago, and I've been looking forward to this event ever since. Nancy, in your honor, I selected a black and white Veritas shield, not the conventional red, so crimson, I should say, so it would match your dress. Now, the other person I would like to thank publicly is our son Teddy, who is, you see here, with the Weeks footbridge in the background. This was a great day for our family. We were watching our older son, Willie, row in the head of the Charles. When the Nieman Foundation kind of let me know that they would like me to, they were encouraging me to apply, I got a big lump on my throat because Teddy was in 6th grade, and we didn't want to uproot him from all of his friends in Wilmette. And Barbara and I had a big discussion about it with Teddy, and to our great surprise, when we asked Teddy whether he wanted to go to Cambridge, he said, "I want to see the world." And so can we have a hand for Teddy? We love you, Teddy. Now, it was a great year for us, for our whole family, and once the image pops up, you'll really see why. There it is. There's Barbara and our older son, Willie. This is Willie Rose at Amherst, and as I mentioned, we were thrilled to see him in head of the Charles, and while we were only 2 hours away, we really tried to maintain, we weren't there every weekend, just every other weekend, to check in on whether he was keeping his room clean, and he didn't, but that's the way it is. All right, so welcome to a book party for a new ebook that literally was published today. It is called The Gates of Harvard Yard. And as a news guy from the Chicago Tribune, I am thrilled to bring you this bit of news and to tell you that when I was working on this ebook, and I knew that Nancy had invited me here tonight, I couldn't think of a more appropriate place to launch a book about Harvard Yard's gates. And as all of you know, I think, the first gate, the main gate at Harvard University, has Chicago's imprint all over it. It is called the Johnston Gate, and it is a donation from Samuel Johnston, class of 1885. And there it is. And if you really want to see the imprint of Chicago, you look inside the gate on the yard-facing side. You see Samuel Johnston's personal seal, this eagle with a wreath around it. And if you look closely at the Latin letters, you see references to Chicago, where Samuel Johnston lived until his death in 1886, and Cincinnati, where he was born in 1833. Now, I want to talk about another Chicago and Midwestern connection in explaining this Nieman program, where Nancy said, rather mischievously, that we are allowed to fabricate whatever program. That sounds like we do a lot of partying, which we do. But anyway, interestingly enough, the Nieman Foundation for journalism at Harvard was started by two Midwesterners who you see pictured here. On your left is Agnes Wall Nieman, who actually grew up in Chicago, born to a very wealthy family. You can kind of see that in the way she dresses with that fancy flapper hat. And then her husband, Lucius Nieman, was from Milwaukee, very different upbringing, hardscrabble background, but he was the founder of the Milwaukee Journal. When you look here on the document to the letter to President Conant of Harvard, 1936, we see that Agnes Wall Nieman left the sum of $1 million to Harvard University for specified purposes. Now, $1 million in 1936 is the equivalent of $16.7 million today. So it was a rather large gift. And the purpose of the gift, as you can see, was to promote and elevate the standards of journalism and educate persons deemed especially qualified for journalism. And so the Nieman Foundation for Journalism was established 2 years later in 1938. We are celebrating our 75th anniversary this year. And as you can see from the bottom two bullet points, President Conant committed the Nieman gift to funding sabbatical fellowships for experienced journalists. And as you can see from the third bullet, he did this against his better judgment. Newspapermen in those days were hard drinking, not very well educated, in short, not the kind of people who went to Harvard. And so you can see that in early 1938, he allowed how this was a, quote, very dubious experiment. All right, well, we've gone on, and in case you don't know where the Niemans have our program, I've given you this map of Harvard. And this is where we are, the Walter Lippmann House. It's up on Broadway, not too far from William James Hall, which is a high-rise designed by Minoru Yamasaki, the architect of the World Trade Center. And this is our clubhouse. Beautiful old house on what used to be called Professor's Row. It is 1 Francis Avenue. And I'm talking about gates tonight, and to walk through these particular rather modest gates is nonetheless a great honor for any journalist. Among past Niemans are Robert Caro, the great biographer of Lyndon Johnson, and also Robert Moses. Susan Orlean, the New Yorker writer. Buzz Bissinger, the author of Friday Night Lights. Chicago Tribune columnist and Pulitzer Prize winner Mary Schmeek. And Henry Lipinski, also a Pulitzer Prize winner and the former editor of the Chicago Tribune and now the curator herself of the Nieman Foundation, the first woman curator. Here is our class, the great class of 2013, the greatest Nieman class ever, a class that will never be topped. And this was a long time ago in a galaxy far away when it was August of 2012 when we were just starting, and Anne Marie announced to us that she was going to work us to the bone. And you can tell that, here's a picture of Anne Marie with Buzz Bissinger, and you can see in her gaze that kind of laser-like intensity that she brings. And I'm actually not sure here whether she's really focusing on Buzz Bissinger's book or whether she's noticing all the hand jewelry that he's wearing. Anyway, so Anne Marie said she would work us to the bone, and in my case, that actually meant it wasn't so much being worked to the bone, it was my feet and my shoes in particular that were worked to the bone. And I don't know if you in the back can see, but I'm kind of doing an Adlai Stevenson imitation here with the holy shoes. So what did we do? Well, we had some extraordinary times together. Early on, we went up to New Hampshire on a bus trip, and we visited Donald Hall, the Poet Laureate of the United States. Later, Tina Brown dropped by and gossiped with us and talked about her time at the New Yorker, Newsweek, and the Daily Beast. And of course, we were free to take whatever classes we wanted. So Barbara took Henry Louis Gates, and we got to know Jill Lepore, the American history professor. Her kid was on Teddy's soccer team, so we got to know her on the sideline, and we saw her grading doctoral dissertations while she was watching her son play soccer. That was kind of a frightening thought, but we didn't tell any of the students, so anyway. We got to go to class in magnificent buildings like Henry Hobson Richardson's Seaver Hall, which you can see here, the extraordinary carved brick of Seaver, just everybody's favorite building, I think, at Harvard. And we also, during our program, gave what are called soundings. And the sounding is a big Nieman tradition. It's kind of like you, and this is a picture from my sounding, you kind of explain who you are, where you came from, and why you do what you do. And in addition to that, you also serve a banquet, a meal that is reflective of your cultural identity. It's kind of regional cuisine. So the Nieman from Maine served lobster. The Nieman from New Orleans served gumbo. I served mayonnaise. And, is there a better place in Chicago than mayonnaise? Of course not. And so I told the other fellows that they weren't eating like kings, but they were eating like Barack Obama and Valerie Jarrett. And we got to make, jokes about Chicago's appetite, unquenchable appetite for bigness, as evidenced by the Willis Tower, Sears Tower, if you prefer, and the giant corned beef sandwiches at Manny's. We even did up the Manny's for Micah. As you can see on our tabletops, we even imported, you can barely see there, but there's a Manny's cup, which has the giant corned beef sandwich and everything. So we really tried to do it up right. During the sounding, you tell who you are. So let me just give you a little bit of background by myself, about myself, I should say. As you can see in the image on the left, I am a product of the Jersey Shore. And one of my favorite places in the world is this spit of sand that extends into New York Bay. It's called Sandy Hook. It's a very different Sandy Hook than the one that we all got to know because of the shootings at the school in Connecticut. But my love of the lakefront right out here is based in my experiences on this great national park. It is part of the Gateway National Park in New York. And the reason that I have always fought for an open, public lakefront is that I experienced those joys of body surfing and running in the sand and not having to pay thousands of dollars to belong to a beach club at the Jersey Shore. My parents, interestingly enough, lived in a very old house. You can see here that over the wall, over the door front, I should say. The house, we think, was built in the late 18th century, 1789. And this, again, I grew up with history, so I have this deep appreciation, as the tourists do, who you're seeing here in the Rookery, for the value of architectural preservation and history and what it can bring to a community. As Nancy said, I went to Amherst College. That's where I first got interested in architecture through a professor who taught a tremendous class in Gothic architecture. I then went to what Harvard people like to refer as the safety school in New Haven, and wound up here in a tower that looks very much like the Harkness Tower, the centerpiece, the Gothic centerpiece at Yale. I'd just like to tell you one story of how I got my job at the Chicago Tribune. This was in 1984 or so, maybe 1985, and I was working at the Des Moines Register, and I was interviewing with the guy you see on the left, Dick Ciccone, who was then the managing editor of the Chicago Tribune. Dick is a former Marine. He has really nice biceps, and he always liked to wear short-sleeve shirts that kind of showed them off. And I was sitting in his office, and he said, "Well, kid, what do you want to do in 5 years?" And I said, "Well, you know, Mr. Ciccone, someday maybe I'd like to write about architecture here." And so he said, "Well, you're probably wondering how old Gap is." And Paul Gap, as you see on the right, was the architecture critic at the time, Pulitzer Prize winner, someone I really revered. And so I said, "Well, you know, yeah, maybe I'd be interested to know how old Paul Gap was." So Ciccone picked up the phone and he dials it and he goes, "Personnel, this is Ciccone, how old's Gap?" And 55 or 56 came back the answer. And then he knew Paul really well, so he called Paul up and he goes, "Hey, Gap, this is Ciccone. I got this guy in here who wants your job. Get in there." And Stanley Tigerman, who's sitting in the front row, is laughing because he knew Paul Gap, and he knew what a sweet man Paul Gap was, a true gentleman. You can see the famous Gap grin that Barbara and I love. And Paul came in, he looked at one of my stories, and he said, "Kid, that's a nice lead," which meant that he liked the first paragraph of my story. So I was like, you know, really, 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 really. All right, so let's go to the gates. And our patron saint, as it were, of the evening, Sam Johnston, Harvard class of 1855. Now, I don't know how much you know about him, but I was able to glean this much from the wonderful 150th anniversary of the Harvard Club of Chicago that was given to me by Walter. Thank you so much. It's a great reference. You can see that Johnston was a financier and real estate entrepreneur. He also, I don't know if you know this, he also was the patron who donated the Shakespeare Statue in Lincoln Park, and his name is on that. There is a story that when the Chicago fire roared by Johnston's house in the Gold Coast, he actually stood on his porch, lifted his glass, and raised a toast to it. Now, you know, that is rather bizarre behavior, but I mean, the guy was a land developer. So clearly, I mean, the O'Learys probably should be looking into Sam Johnston and whether he was the one who actually started the fire. Okay. So yesterday, as you can do at a newspaper, I went and looked for the Sam Johnston in our files, and sure enough, in 1886, shortly after he died, his will was read, and it was big news because he was a really rich guy. And he was worth roughly $500,000 in 1886, which was big, big money. So if you look, and I know it's going to be hard to do if you're in the back of the room, but if you look in this will, here, I'm going to just drag the mic with me. No, I'm not. Whoops. Well, anyway, if you look in, it's okay. If you look in item 15, you see, as I'm trying to with my lousy eyesight, that Sam left $10,000 for the erection of the main gate in front of the college yard at Harvard University. Quite an impressive bequest. And this is the Shakespeare statue, just for your reference. And if you look down at the bottom, you can see that it says the bequest of Samuel Johnston. Here's the gate from the inside the yard, looking out toward the church across the way. It's the wrought iron in this gate is extraordinary, as you see here. You can see the date, 1889, and the small shield or escutcheon below the cross. The cross, of course, stands for Harvard's commitment to train ministers, a big agenda item of the Puritans who founded the place. And of course, 1636, the year of Harvard's founding. The gate occupies a central place in Harvard's architectural identity. This, of course, is Memorial Hall, the great monument to the Civil War cause and the cause of abolition. A high Victorian Gothic building, polychromatic, over the top, gargoyles, you name it. Charles McKim, who designed the Johnston Gate, really changed Harvard's architectural emphasis, bringing it back to the Georgian Revival style of Massachusetts Hall and Harvard Hall, and really created a series of a kind of Georgian Revival scrim, like you see here with the Morgan Gate along Massachusetts Avenue and the two Wigglesworth Halls, that really kind of masked the eclectic jumble that Harvard architecture had become before the Johnston Gate was built. I didn't know any of this a year ago today when Willie and I, our older son, were driving to Harvard. And so when I got there, I was intrigued by these gates and their ornament and these numbers. What did these numbers, 77, what did that mean? And what were these strange creatures like these rams, this ram's head in stone, a ram's head that was chewing on leaves? Why was that there? And then there was another Chicago connection in the famous Dexter Gate. Samuel Dexter, the class of 1890, was born in Chicago in 1867, and he died only 4 years after his graduation. So what happened to Samuel Dexter? And then there were other things that were honestly very disturbing. This is a close-up of a fountain with a lion's head looking over it in the classes of 1887 and 88 Double Gate, the only circular gate, the only double gate sponsored by 2 classes in the yard. As you can see, it was being used, it's still being used as essentially garbage dump. Being a good reporter, I picked up the bottle of vodka in there and noticed that it sold for $9.99. Actually, which is the same price as the ebook. God, that's amazing. I never thought of that until now. Anyway. But this was kind of disgusting. This is a McKim Mead and White gate, and Harvard's treating it like dirt, literally. Okay, whoops, a little mistake there, sorry about that. Okay, well all this, led to a class called, there it is, called Rate the Gates, which was a winter session or January term class. And we had 9 students, 2 other Nieman Fellows and I taught it, and we gave the students 8 days to research and do visual analysis of 2 gates apiece. So here I am with 2 of the students. We schooled them in Chicago journalism. So there's an expression in the newsroom called hat and coat, which means you have to go out, and cover a news story no matter how cold it is. So this day it was like 20 degrees, it was freezing, and we made the students stand outside the gates for like half an hour straight and count the number of people who were passing through, because we wanted to see how many people used the gates. And even in January, interestingly enough, in only half an hour, 1,300 people coursed through the different gates. We also taught them things like the famous saying from the Chicago City News Bureau about fact-checking. And this is a line I'm sure you've heard: when your mother says she loves you, check it out. So that's Chicago, right? Okay, so the Harvard Gazette wound up, we published the students' essays in a kind of quick and dirty website. The Harvard Gazette wrote a very nice story about our efforts. And ultimately, I decided that the students' work was so good that it should be turned into an ebook. And so we did it. And whoops, I just blew my, and so now I want to show you the ebook. Okay, this is a page from the ebook. And this is in the introduction, and this shows you what Harvard Yard looked like before the Johnston Gate was built. Okay? It is a very simple post and rail fence, appropriate for a small, somewhat parochial college, which is exactly what Harvard was. And I don't say that disparagingly because I'm from Yale. I mean, even Harvard people will tell you that that's what Harvard was until President Eliot took over, and here he is, and really pumped up the university and made it the great world-renowned research university it is today. Gates are pervasive at Harvard. You can see that here. You walk through them as you go to football games. There even are modernist gates, as at Leverett, the high-rises along the Charles River. So let me get to our favorite gate. Oh, actually, let me give you this map first. So there are 25 gates that encircle the yard. Here's a map of them, okay? 7 of the gates are permanently locked, largely for security reasons. Some of them have been locked for decades. And the main gate that we're going to look at is Johnston, and that's right here. So you can see how in this gate, in this shot, how Charles McKim of McKim, Mead & White, the architect, really was trying to harmonize with the Georgian architecture of Massachusetts Hall, which is on your right, the building with the clock, and Harvard Hall, the building with the cupola that you see on the left. Now, this is where it gets fun. Here's Johnston Gate, and this is the kind of thing that you can do with an iPad book. You can have interactive iPhone panoramas. They take you, here's Johnston Gate, and you can go up, you can go down, and you can ride the merry-go-round all the way around Harvard Square and see exactly what this looks like. Now this is fun, but it is also an amazing tool for historians. I mean, think in 50 years, they will be able to see exactly what was happening in Harvard Square, something they could not do with a still picture of the gate. Other things we can do with this interactive format, let's say you are reading the book and you don't really know what Gothic revival means. So you press a button and a definition pops up. Kind of neat. Then you can enlarge pictures and you can see how the Puritans really never really mastered spelling very well. But that's why they needed smart people from Harvard to train ministers. Now, this is a detail on the back of Johnston Gate that is fascinating. Samuel Johnston donated $10,000 for this gate. And as often happens with architects, they ran short on the budget. They did not have enough money for the wrought iron, the extraordinary web of wrought iron that McKim, Mead & White had designed. So to the rescue came Marion Alice Appleton, whose initials you see in reverse right here on the back of the gate. Can you see those? See where it says AAM? Well, that is actually MAA, and it's pretty clear to me that McKim, Mead & White did that to match the reverse image of 1636 on the backdrop. So I guess you could call it the Johnston Appleton Gate, but for Chicago purposes, it is the Johnston Gate. Only, not the Appleton Gate. Okay, let's move. I just want to show you a couple of other gates. And, okay, here's the Dexter Gate, the other gate with the Chicago connection. And this is along Massachusetts Avenue. You can see that it's a striped gate. And you can also see through the archival photos how much the setting of this gate has changed. This is the way the gate looked in 1901 when it was built. Many of the gates, by the way, were built in 1901. You can see that the yard looks very rural. There's a slope in the background, there are trees, and actually, interestingly enough, this gate was based upon a design by Sebastiano Serlio, a Renaissance architect, and his idea was for a rural or rustic gate, which had it alternated rough and smooth materials. And interestingly enough, it was very fitting for this setting, which was rustic. And then this is the way the gate looks now, not so rustic. In fact, when Wigglesworth was built, as you can plainly see, they had to cut this arch right through the middle of the first floor so people could pass through. Now, when the students dug through the archives, they found some fascinating material. And let me go here. So it turns out that, I am sad to say, that Samuel Dexter died suddenly of cerebrospinal meningitis, only 4 years after he graduated. And this was really a tragedy because he was one of the most promising members of the class of 1890. What happened was that his mother commissioned the gate as a memorial to him and consulted with President Eliot on a series of maxims that actually appear on this gate, and they're very famous. You all know this maxim, enter to grow in wisdom, often quoted in commencement speeches and the like. Well, as our students were going through the archives, they found that many alternative versions for these quotations were considered. For example, there was one version that was considered enter daily to grow in wisdom, which is a small change to be sure, but it sounds prescriptive rather than Olympian. It lacks the kind of Olympian simplicity of enter to grow in wisdom. On the backside, or as you're coming out of the gate into Harvard Square to Massachusetts Avenue, it says, depart to serve better thy country and thy kind. Now, thy kind has always sparked debate. What does thy kind mean? Other rich white men attending an elite institution? It turns out that they had considered depart to serve better thy country and mankind, but that kind of lacked the alliteration of country and kind, so they went with thy kind. They also thought of really dumb things like to serve better thy brothers and things like that, which, you know, thankfully they didn't do. It was fascinating to us to see that something that seemed so inevitable had actually been debated, and there were alternatives for it. Now, I mentioned the neglect of the gates, and this is the sort of poster child for that. This is the class of 1870 gate. It's just a couple down from Johnston Gate. It was designed by McKim, Mead & White, and you can see here how delicate this gate is in contrast to the kind of robust Chicago-style Johnston Gate. There's a beautiful sundial that you see in the foreground here that was part of the gift of the class of 1870. It says, on this moment hangs eternity. Very beautiful. You can see here that the gate is locked permanently as a security measure, and how it's raised like an eyebrow that beautifully frames the blue gable of Holden Chapel. And you can see on the right how the gate looked when it was open. It really formed a beautiful threshold with a step leading up into this little courtyard with the wonderful sundial in it, and then this kind of very intimate space, much more small scale, really telling you about the Harvard of the 18th and 19th centuries as opposed to the very large spaces in front of Widener Library. But that experience is no more because the university has locked the gate. And then this was the killer. One of the students, the student who wrote this, discovered that the leaves at the bottom of the wrought iron post were crumbling, and one of them had actually cracked and was breaking apart, hanging almost literally by a thread. So on my last day in Cambridge, I went to Trinity Church and saw as many great buildings as I could before I was going to come back to Chicago, and I went by this gate because it is my favorite gate, and I kind of like watch out for it. And that leaf that you just saw had fallen off and was resting in the middle of a 4-square post. And it was like a horrible decision because usually journalists don't get involved in a story. So what was I to do? Let the, this little leaf stay there where it would get blown away, or some tourist would find it and take it home, and God knows what would happen. So anyway, I picked it up and I delivered it to Laurie Gross, who's the assistant provost associate provost, I should say, for arts and culture, and I gave it to her for safekeeping. And but this image tells you a lot about Harvard's treatment of these gates, and it's extraordinary to me that it's almost like the university doesn't know the abundance of riches that it has in these gates. And so this story is kind of a mix of glory on the one hand and neglect on the other. So, as you can see, I had gates on the brain this year, and it occurred to me that as I took classes at the Graduate School of Design, that gates are universal and near universal of human experience, from the Forbidden City to the Brandenburg Gate to the Gateway Arch to the ugly gates that line American subdivisions. Gates are pervasive. I mean, you could say, as I do in the first line in the book, that there really are three certainties in life: death, taxes, and gates. I think that gates really are fascinating, not just at Harvard, but everywhere. And this suggests three reasons why they restrict and choreograph our movement through urban space. They are potent symbols. They don't merely facilitate or forbid entry, they confer status or communicate messages of power. And at their best, like the greatest of the Harvard gates, the gates are both part of the urban fabric, a part of the city, but they're worthy of contemplation as individual aesthetic objects on their own. Stanley Tigerman, who is sitting here tonight, often talked about dualities. And I remember he talked about Janus, the Roman god of doors and gates. And this is Janus, right at Adam's house, the house with which I affiliated during my time at Harvard. Gates are about transitions, entering from one realm to another. And it's easy to see, knowing how fraught and perilous transitions can be, why the Romans would have wanted to have a god of gates. Because transitions are difficult, they're scary. So you want to be blessed whether you're entering or leaving. And this really came home at the end of the fellowship year when Barbara and I gave each other gifts. Unbeknownst to each other, we had both been inspired by the entering Cambridge sign that you see when you come into Cambridge. For us, Cambridge was not just a place, it was a state of mind. It was a place of lifelong learning, a fellowship, a place where we felt young. I'm 56 now, where we were lucky to take this all in. So on their last day, as we gave each other gifts, I gave Barbara this postcard with the Entering Cambridge motto on it, and I said, even when we come back to Chicago, let's always be entering Cambridge, no matter where we are. And of course, Barbara gave me a much nicer gift. She actually gave me a sign that said Entering Cambridge, which now hangs in our house. So I just want to say that the Nieman year was marvelous. It was an incredible experience to be able to see and to research and to take the time and slow down, far away from the pressures of daily journalism, from Twitter posts, tweets, and blog posts, and all these things, and to slow down and see the majesty of the gates and their meaning within Harvard and their meaning within the broader realm of our lives. And that, of course, all began where everything in architecture begins, Chicago. Thank you very much.
Where are some wonderful gates in Chicago?
I'm sorry?
Where are some wonderful gates in Chicago?
Okay, the question is, where are some wonderful gates in Chicago? Let's see, I'd say about 5600 South at the University of Chicago. Now this is interesting. The UC has an extraordinary series of Gothic gates, not Georgian Revival gates. The whole gate, in particular, at UC is a feast of Gothic ornament. It has grotesques, it has gargoyles, You know, no Harry Potter set designer could do better. It's really extraordinary. I think there are also gateways in Chicago. The Wrigley Building and the Tribune Tower were conceived as a gateway to the privileged retail precinct of North Michigan Avenue. The University Club and the Monroe Building, with their repeating gables, were conceived as gateways into the Loop from Grant Park. We have other gateways like O'Hare. You know, Helmet. I always feel great when I walk into the United Terminal. Despite the lousy security and service, it's a tremendous piece of architecture. That is a great gateway to a great architectural city. So those would be some of my favorite architectural gateways. Yeah.
Cloud Gate.
Paula? Cloud Gate. Well, right up. Yeah. Thank you, Paula Duffy, who is running the University of Chicago Press, and I published a book there, just suggested Cloud Gate, and which of course you all know quite well. Yes?
So what did the vice provost do with the broken leaf?
What did the associate provost do with the broken leaf? I don't know. I
Did
sent her.
she act like she thought there was a problem?
Oh
there?
yeah, she acted. Yeah, she knew that I was giving her. You know, this wasn't the destruction of the Chicago Stock Exchange. Let me put it that way. But it was still, you know, a piece of, you know, like a fleck of paint or something from a Picasso. So you wanted to save it. Yeah, actually, Lori Gross used to work at the Canadian Center for Architecture. So she knows from architecture, and you know, she will take care of it. And I'm sure that I firmly expect that when I go back for the Nieman reunion at the end of September, it will be taken care of. Otherwise, there's going to be hell to pay. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. You mentioned with the Johnston Gate, has that got problems too, that maybe the Harvard Club of Chicago could adopt or readopt the thing and help to?
Funny you should mention that. Yes. Its problems are not as severe. Let me see if I can go back. There are problems of landscaping. And we have Peter Shout, a landscape architect here, so I'm sure he can whip up a solution in no time flat. If you look at this image, look closely at see the fire hydrant? And see the snow around the tree. And then around the snow is a bunch of mud. Okay, that is not the way the Johnston Gate was meant to look. The Johnston Gate is the area. You can all see where I'm talking about, right? Okay. So originally, the archival photos show that area that's now a patch of mud was grass. And there were trees and grass there, and the area was really an extension of the yard, as is the gate. And I just want to make the point here that the gates are a fascinating combination of the militaristic and the naturalistic. In other words, like the fortified cities of old, they have spear-tip finials on the fence, right? But they extend the nature of the yard. So you can see here at the top of Johnston Gate, these beautiful leaves that are, you know, some blacksmith just crafted those. I mean, to think of the work that went into that, it's extraordinary. So yes, there are problems with the Johnston Gate in terms of its landscaping. I think we actually calculated this. A giving opportunity, now let's see here. New sod in this area, which is about 190 square feet on either side, would cost less than $500, a pittance compared to the thousands Harvard spent in 2011 to restore the yard after its muddy 375th anniversary bash. The fountain on the gates, now missing a faucet, could be made even more attractive even if the water remains off. That's the fountain on the inside. So those are two small things. Otherwise, this gate is in pretty good shape. But I would just say this: if this club wants to adopt this gate, it is kind of our patrimony, Chicago's patrimony to Harvard. I promise you, I'm saying right here that I will kick in the first $5 for that. Okay, I'm a journalist, man. I'm not a titan of industry. Okay. Yes. Any other questions? Yeah.
Did you ever find out what the 77 meant on the day?
Yeah. I'm sorry. Yes. So the question is, did I ever find out what 77 meant on the gate? Yes, and I should have said this in my talk. The gates are largely sponsored by Harvard classes. Harvard, as you know, has a tradition of giving by alumni class. And that tradition started, interestingly enough, with Memorial Hall. The stained glass windows in Memorial Hall were donated by classes who wished to memorialize the Union soldiers who died in the Civil War. So when it came time to fund the gates, the same tradition was used, and so the class of 1877 and other classes were the prime donors. However, there were, some of the gates have, like Dexter or Bacon, have last names associated with them, and that is because there were some huge donors who were big, just huge givers, so the gates have their names. The roster of these major donors tells you a lot about Harvard. I mean, there are cabinet secretaries, there are Wall Street magnates, there are descendants of Puritans. One gate, which is, well, let's see if I can find it. Well, I just, if you get me going on this, I'll never shut up. Let's see if I can find it. There's a fascinating story about one gate that is no longer there, and I just want to show it to you very briefly. Okay, now you've never, if anybody ever saw this gate, they are really old. This gate, the Dudley Gate, was built in 1915, and it was demolished in 1947 to make way for Lamont Library. I'm sorry?
It was the end of my day then.
That's right. We have someone here who graduated Radcliffe in 1944 from DeKalb. Wait, that is amazing. Do you remember this gate?
I don't think so. In those days, shall we say, Radcliffe was not encouraged to get near the library, except Widener, where your professor gave you a special pass.
Okay, so you don't remember this gate, but it's a memorable gate.
Lamont Library when it was being built.
Right, exactly. And so you probably saw this gate being demolished. This is a fascinating gate because unlike most of the McKim gates, which are very symmetrical, this gate is not symmetrical. As you can see, it was the only gate that had its own clock tower. And it also had this statue. It's a little hard to see. I'll try to expand it. Of Thomas Dudley, the Puritan forebear, who was one of the university's founders. Interestingly enough, when the statue this bas-relief was commissioned and completed, it said under it, first governor of Massachusetts, which, as you all know, was completely wrong. It was John Winthrop, of course, who was the first governor. So the New York Tribune wrote a great expose, Harvard Gate has graven error. And the architects they were absolutely crestfallen, and they suggested that Harvard literally paper over their mistake with using like paper that was colored the same color as the stone of the gate. And so that's what happened. But you can see this is one of the gates that replaced it, rather unassuming, and then the other gate that replaced it, whoops, sorry. Where is it? Oh, it's right here. And this is the Lamont Library utility gate, which leads to about 17 garbage cans in the back of Lamont Library. So we did get Harvard got a great undergraduate library. It really is a pleasure to study there, but it definitely lost out in the gate department in that exchange.
Governor Winthrop was the governor of the Massachusetts colony. He
Correct.
was not the governor of the state of Massachusetts.
I'm sorry, Massachusetts Bay Colony. I stand corrected, as Harvard was many years ago. Thank you. Yes?
Would you mind some comments about Chicago architecture? Where do you see important breakthroughs in the future, and who to watch in particular in Chicago?
Okay. Now the question has turned to the fraught matter of Chicago architecture and who will be giving us breakthroughs and who to watch and what are the big upcoming trends. Well, let's start with two very distinguished Harvard graduates, John Ronan and Jeannie Gang. I think they've spoken to this club before. They have certainly emerged as leaders of the new generation of Chicago architects, Jeannie with Aqua, of course, and other commissions, John with his Poetry Foundation headquarters. John does not have the same name recognition, and he's not the same publicity machine that Jeannie Gang is, but he's a very talented architect, and I really expect great things from both of them. There are other terrific architects in this room. We have Avi Lothan, a GSD graduate, and he too is very talented, and is that Avi applauding in the background? Or his wife? And I think that there are some signs that Rahm Emanuel is starting to get it, that architecture actually matters in the same way that Rich Daley got it. We're seeing that with the funding of Navy Pier, the new redevelopment plan for Navy Pier by James Corner of the High Line. The Bloomingdale Trail, now known as the 606. Rahm is very big on that. So we'll see. But I think linear parks like the Bloomingdale Trail are very important. And I think what's been fascinating to me is just in the last few weeks is to watch all these bike stations pop up. I mean, this is really like, it's like a revolution. It's like Cambridge, all these liberals biking around, dangerous. Jeez. I mean, next thing you know, it's going to be the People's Republic of Chicago, anyway. All right, one more, Nancy says. Way in the back.
Well, first of all, one of the famous Chicago gates is at the Union Stockyards.
Yeah, thank you. Very good.
But secondly,
Yeah.
I'd like to know how your Nieman Fellowship is going to affect what we read in the Tribune.
Okay. In other words, I love this kind of, it's such a Chicago question. So the first observation was one of the famous Chicago gates is the Union Stockyards Gate, and thank you for that. And I really don't appreciate your second question, which is, how is this Nieman Fellowship, this joyride, going to affect what we read in the Tribune? So practical here, right, Steve? All right, well, it's already affecting what you read in the Tribune. Every piece I write is infused with ideas, seriously, that I picked up while I was away. And what I really hope to do in terms of big dreams is to finally get to China and to see the impact that Chicago's architects are having on its extraordinary transformation. One of our fellows was from China. And we just got a Facebook message from her. She was talking about how, there were 10 buildings that, in the year that she was gone, like 10 giant buildings had popped up. And, people used to talk about Chicago as a kind of place that grew at warp speed. Well, I mean, Chinese speed leaves Chicago's speed in the dust. It is an extraordinary evolution, and it's one that I really, hope to look at. So I guess in conclusion, I would just say that being in Harvard opened gates and it opened realms of ideas to me. That was the whole purpose of the Nieman Fellowship. And I kind of have a contract with you, my readers, at the Chicago Tribune, which was that I would go away for a year and then I would come back and I would be refreshed, revived, etc. And I really do feel that, amazingly. I was kind of dreading coming back, because this was the newspaper that had gone through Sam Zell for 3 years. And, Zell, which rhymes with hell. But it's been great to be back. The paper, I think, has found itself, its voice, and is really doing some great things. And with the aid of a Nieman Fellowship, I hope to be part of that. So thank you all very much.